April 15th, 1912, 2 a.m., the North Atlantic, 430 miles southeast of Newfoundland. The Titanic is slipping beneath the water. Freezing water, screams, panic, and the radio waves. There are 2 wireless operators aboard the Titanic. Jack Phillips, 25, Harold Bride, 22. They have been working on and off for 12 hours, sending distress signals, CQD, SOS, calls for help, but all around them, silence. The Carpathia answered, the Baltic answered, the Olympic was too far away. The Californian didn't answer at all. Its radio operator turned off the receiver at 11:30 p.m., half an hour before the collision. At 2:17 a.m., Bride shuts down the transmitter. He realizes there is no point anymore. A sinking ship cannot transmit signals. The antennas are going underwater. He jumps overboard 10 minutes before the Titanic disappears beneath the waves. Phillips stays behind. His body will never be found. But there was someone else. Someone not listed in the official records. Someone who was listening to the airwaves that night. Not aboard the Titanic. On a small ship. A cargo vessel. A merchant ship. He heard more than distress signals. He heard something else. Something that kept him silent for 50 years. His name was John Harris, a radio operator aboard the merchant ship Bremen. That night, the Bremen was 200 miles east of the Titanic. It could not reach her in time. But he listened all night long, and he wrote everything down. He recorded more than SOS signals. He recorded conversations between ships, conversations that began before the Titanic struck the iceberg, conversations that showed someone knew about the ice, knew about the danger, knew the Titanic was moving too fast. But these records were never presented at any investigation, not the British inquiry, not the American inquiry. Because 2 days after the Carpathia brought the survivors to New York, representatives of White Star Line came aboard the Bremen. They confiscated the radio operator's logbook and burned it. John Harris swore to remain silent, but before his death in 1962, he told everything to his son. His son recorded the story. Today, you'll learn what John Harris heard, what signals passed through the airwaves that night, and why White Star Line burned the record. John Harris was born in 1885 in Liverpool, England. His father was a dock worker. His mother worked as a cleaner. The family lived in a neighborhood known as the Maze, dirty streets, overcrowded buildings, and a shared outhouse for 10 families. At the age of 14, he went to work as a cabin boy on a merchant ship. 14-hour workdays. He slept in a hammock next to the boilers. He learned to read and write from the chief engineer, who noticed his potential. In 1905, he became interested in radio. The technology was new. Marconi's wireless telegraph. He took courses, got his license, found work as a radio operator aboard the merchant ship Bremen. The Bremen was a small cargo vessel. It sailed between Liverpool and New York, carried textiles, coal, and sometimes livestock. It had a simple radio transmitter. Its range was about 250 miles in good weather, but in April 1912, the weather was clear, starry, cold. Harris was married. He had 2 children, lived modestly, earned £6 a week. He wasn't rich, wasn't famous. He was simply doing his job, listening to the airwaves 8 hours a day. On the night of April 14th to 15, he was on duty from midnight until 8 a.m. At 12:15 a.m., he heard the first signal, CQD, come quick, danger. The first words he heard were CQD, 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 from Titanic, 40-4N, 50-24W. Harris wrote it down in his logbook. Then he fully woke up and kept writing throughout the night. April 14th, 1912, 11:40 p.m., the Titanic collides with an iceberg. The compartments begin filling with water. Captain Smith orders the radio operators to send a distress signal. At 12:15 a.m., Phillips sends the first CQD. At 12:25 a.m., SOS. The SOS signal was new. Very few people used it, but Phillips decided to try it. At 12:45 a.m., the Carpathia responds. She is 58 miles away, steaming at full speed, but reaching maximum speed will take 4 hours. The Titanic only has 2 hours left. At 1:25 a.m., the Carpathia transmits. Coming as fast as we can. Hold on. Phillips replies. Water in boiler room number 6. The bow is going down fast. At 1:45 a.m., radio communication begins to deteriorate. Static. Interference. Phillips keeps transmitting. At 2 a.m., Captain Smith releases the radio operators from their duties. They are free to leave the ship. Phillips refuses to leave. He continues transmitting signals. At 2:17 a.m., the transmitter goes silent. Forever. But Harris aboard the Bremen heard more than these distress calls. He heard conversations between ships that took place 3 hours before the collision. Conversations in which one vessel warned another about the ice, and the other vessel ignored the warning. These conversations were never published. Harris kept a detailed logbook. He recorded every transmission, the time, the call sign, the message. His handwriting was small but easy to read. Here is what he wrote down. Beginning at 11 p.m. on April 14th, 40 minutes before the collision. 11 p.m., the Californian transmits to the Titanic. Stopped in ice. Coordinates 42.05 IN, 50.07W. Ice field extending south. The Titanic replies. Message received. Good night. 11:15 p.m. The Californian tries again. We are surrounded by ice. A lot of ice. We recommend reducing speed. No reply. The Californian's radio operator, Cyril Evans, turns off the receiver at 11:30 p.m., goes to sleep. 11:35 p.m. Harris writes down, the Titanic transmits to White Star Line headquarters in Liverpool, all systems operating normally. Speed 22 knots. Await report upon arrival. 11:40 p.m. The collision. Harris doesn't know it yet. He hears only silence. 12:15 a.m. The first distress signal. Harris writes, CQD, 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 Titanic, coordinates for it Armadurgovio N, 50.4W, immediate assistance required. 12:25 a.m. The Titanic transmits SOS for the first time in history. SOS is a new signal. Phillips jokingly says to Bride, maybe this will be our last chance to use it. 12:35 a.m. The Carpathia answers. Harris writes, Carpathia to Titanic, coming to you, full speed, hold on. 12:45 a.m. The Titanic transmits, water in the compartments, bow going down fast, many passengers in lifeboats, but not enough lifeboats. 1 a.m. The Olympic comes on the line. Harris writes, Olympic to Titanic. We are 500 miles away, won't make it. Carpathia will arrive first. 1:25 a.m. The Baltic transmits, we are coming too, but we are farther away than the Carpathia. The Titanic replies, thank you, keep listening. 1:45 a.m. Harris notices something strange. The transmissions are becoming shorter. Phillips's voice is weaker. Static is increasing. 2 a.m. The Carpathia transmits. Titanic, do you hear us? Titanic, answer. Silence. 2:10 a.m. The Carpathia again. Titanic, we are close. Hold on. Silence. 2:17 a.m. Harris records the last thing he hears from the Titanic, a fragment of a transmission. 3 letters, C, Q, D, then silence. But Harris recorded something else as well, something he showed no one until 1962. The conversation between the Carpathia and the Californian the following morning, when the Californian finally turned its receiver back on, and when the Carpathia asked, "Where were you last night?" and the Californian replied, "We were stopped in the ice. Our radio operator was asleep." Carpathia: "Did you know the Titanic was sinking?" Californian: "No." Carpathia: "Did you hear the signals?" Californian: "Our operator turned off the receiver at 11:30 p.m. Harris recorded that conversation. Then he tore out the page and hit it. April 18th, 1912. The Carpathia arrives in New York. 705 survivors step ashore. They are greeted by thousands of people, questions, cameras, police. The Bremen arrives in New York the following day, April 19th. There are no survivors aboard. There is a cargo of textiles and coal, and there is a radio operator with a logbook. Harris steps ashore, goes to a waterfront tavern, orders a beer, sits alone, thinks. The next day, 2 men come to see him, men in dark coats. They introduce themselves as representatives of White Star Line. One of them says, "Mr. Harris, we know what you heard. We know what you wrote down. We need your logbook." Harris replies, "The logbook belongs to the ship owner. I cannot give it away." The White Star Line representative reaches into his pocket and takes out an envelope, a thick envelope, filled with money. £500, Mr. Harris, a year's salary. You give us the logbook. You forget what you heard. You tell no one. Do we have a deal? Harris looks at the envelope, thinks about his wife, his children, his house, thinks about the fact that £500 means a new roof, new clothes, food for an entire year. He takes the envelope and hands over the logbook. The White Star Line representative flips through the pages, reads the entries, tears out several pages, then gives the logbook back. The rest is not important. These pages are going into the furnace. He places the torn pages into his briefcase. Harris will never know exactly which pages were removed, but he can guess. The pages about the conversations between the Californian and the Titanic before the collision. The pages about the exchange between the Carpathia and the Californian the next morning. The pages that prove the Californian could have saved lives if its radio operator had not been asleep. Harris remained silent for 50 years. Harris wasn't the only one. Other radio operators aboard other ships also heard strange transmissions. Some of them wrote everything down as well. The most famous was David Sarnoff, a radio operator for the Voice of America, later the legendary head of RCA. Sarnoff claimed he personally received distress signals from the Titanic 2 days before its departure from Southampton. If his testimony is to be believed, he knew about the disaster before it happened, but official investigations dismissed his statements as mistaken. Another radio operator served aboard the Mount Temple. He wrote in his logbook, 2:15 a.m., heard the Titanic transmitting, "Going down, goodbye." This logbook was presented during the British inquiry, but the judges gave it little importance. A third radio operator served aboard the Perez. He recorded the conversation between the Carpathia and the Californian. In his version, the Californian said, "We saw rockets, but thought they were fireworks." This record was seized by representatives of White Star Line and disappeared forever. Harris knew about these records, knew they had vanished, knew his own records were the last ones left. That is why he hid a copy. White Star Line was a major shipping company. The Titanic was its pride, its flagship, the ship that had been called unsinkable. Its loss was both a financial and a reputational disaster. The company feared more than the loss of the ship. It feared the truth that Captain Smith ignored warnings about the ice, the truth that there were only 178 seats in the lifeboats for 2,224 passengers. The truth that the Californian could have saved almost everyone if its radio operator had not been asleep. White Star Line did everything it could to hide that truth. It bribed witnesses, destroyed documents, pressured the investigations. The clearest example involved the radio operator's logbooks. White Star Line sent agents to New York, Liverpool, and Halifax to buy or steal every logbook that might contain records of the Titanic's communications before the collision. They succeeded. Out of 15 ships located within a 500-mile radius of the Titanic, records survived on only 2. On the Bremen, partially. On the Carpathia, completely. But the Carpathia's records were handed over to the British Inquiry and were not fully published until the 1980s. Harris's logbook burned in the fireplace of a New York hotel on the evening of April 19th, 1912. Harris hid a copy, not of the entire logbook, only 7 pages, the most important ones. He hid them inside a Bible, a large family Bible that sat in his house in Liverpool. He never told his wife or his children about it, only shortly before his death. In 1962, Harris is dying at the age of 77. He calls his son William and says, "There are pages inside the Bible. Take them, but show them to no one. The time has not come yet." William finds the pages, reads them, turns pale, calls a lawyer. The lawyer says, "Burn them. White Star Line no longer exists, but their heirs are powerful people. They will destroy you." William does not burn them. He gives the pages to the Titanic Museum in Halifax in 1985, when the wreck of the ship is discovered. The museum director looks at them, says, "There is no conclusive evidence," not because there isn't any, but because the director is afraid of lawsuits. In 2012, on the 100th anniversary of the disaster, one of the pages is published online. It reads, 11:15 p.m., Californian to Titanic. We are stopped in the ice. Ice field extending south. Recommend reducing speed. The page disappears 48 hours later. The museum claims it had nothing to do with it. O'Day, we know far more than people knew in 1912. Thanks to survivor testimonies, thanks to sonar maps, thanks to modern investigations, we know that Captain Smith received at least 6 ice warnings on April 14th. He ignored 5 of them. He was steaming at full speed into an ice field because he wanted to set a record for the Atlantic crossing. We know that the Californian was only 20 miles away from the Titanic. If its radio operator had not been asleep, he would have heard the SOS signals and could have reached the ship within an hour. In an hour, the Titanic would not yet have sunk. Almost everyone could have been saved. We know that White Star Line was aware of the shortage of lifeboats, but did nothing, because lifeboats spoiled the view from the deck, because the rules of the British Merchant Navy were outdated, because nobody believed the unsinkable ship could actually sink. But what don't we know? We do not know the exact contents of John Harris's logbook. The 7 pages he hid have never been fully published. The Titanic Museum in Halifax claims they were lost. However, in 2018, a British researcher stated that he had seen copies of those pages in a private collection in London. The owner wished to remain anonymous. April 15, 1912, 2:15 a.m. John Harris sits inside the radio room of the Bremen and listens to the Titanic's final signals. Weak, broken. He writes them down. C, Q, D. Then silence. He has no idea that within a few days his logbook will burn in a fireplace. He has no idea that his name will disappear from the official reports. He has no idea that he will remain silent for 50 years. But he knows one thing. He heard the truth, and he wrote it down because someone had to. Harris wasn't a hero, wasn't a journalist, wasn't a whistleblower. He was a radio operator. He was simply doing his job. His job was to listen and he listened. Then he wrote everything down. 112 years later, we still do not know the exact contents of his records. We do not know who tore pages out of his logbook. We do not know where those pages are today. But we do know one thing. John Harris was not lying. He had no reason to lie. He never sold his story to newspapers, never gave interviews, never wrote memoirs. He simply kept a logbook for himself, and that logbook is the only thing left from that night, except, of course, for the 705 survivors. But the survivors stayed silent. They didn't want to remember. Harris did, and he wrote it down. The question Harris asked his son before his death was this: why was White Star Line more afraid of my records than of the deaths of 1,500 people? You may find your own answer. I do not insist on mine. Thank you for watching until the end.